I have this friend, right? And she is, I mean, by pretty much every measure you could think of, a genuinely good person.
Yeah.
You know, the type who organizes the charity drives, remembers everyone's birthday. Her social media is just this like perfectly curated stream of support for all the right causes.
Uh-huh.
If you were trying to build a good person in a lab, seriously, you'd probably end up with someone like her.
I know the type.
So we were having coffee last week, just chatting, and this news report comes on the TV in the corner, something about a protest downtown.
Okay.
And she glances at it, and then, like, mid-sentence, she makes this offhand comment.
Oh.
It wasn't, overtly nasty, not a slur or anything like that. It was much more subtle. Just a quick, kind of dismissive joke about how the protesters looked, tying it to some lazy stereotype about their social class.
Mm-hmm.
She said it so casually, I don't think she even really registered it herself. But the comment just sort of hung there in the air between us.
Yeah.
And in that tiny, unguarded moment, something else just peeked through that whole good person facade. Right.
It was this flash of an assumption,
Yeah.
a judgment based not on who they were, but on some pre-written social script about where people belong.
Mm-hmm.
It made me realize something, well, pretty uncomfortable.
Right.
We spend so much time building up this idea ourselves as good, as moral.
Mm.
But what about the programming running underneath all that? The quiet, insidious hierarchies we just absorb without even knowing it.
That unguarded moment. Yeah, that flicker of casual judgment. That is precisely what this deep dive is designed to get into.
Okay.
You've really hit on the critical point where these massive structural power systems, the ones that often operate invisibly, get internalized. They show up as these individual psychological assumptions.
Right.
So our mission today is really to connect that subtle, maybe seemingly harmless comment over coffee to the giant economic, political, and psychological systems of hierarchy. The ones that define our perceptions, shape our societies, dictate opportunity, and crucially, impact our health.
Wow. That sounds like a tall order.
Okay.
Connecting a muttered joke to, global policy failure. We are, because honestly, the connection is inescapable. We're going to tackle this using 3 interconnected lenses.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First, we'll hit the macro systems, looking at the global economic models and policies, especially neoliberalism, and how they actively engineer and enforce hierarchy, how they create economic inequality, really regardless of individual effort.
So the big picture stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then second, we dive into the micromechanisms, the psychology bit, how we internalize those structural judgments, the cumulative trauma they inflict on our bodies and minds, and how that trauma actually takes root.
And the third.
And finally, we'll explore the tools for unlearning and resistance. We'll map out pathways for real lasting change, both at the policy level, the big systemic stuff, and at the personal mindset level.
Okay, let's dive in then. We're starting at that foundational layer, the economic engine that's been driving so much of this inequality for, the last 4 decades?
Yeah, we really have to start with the dominant economic approach since the 1980s, which most people call neoliberalism.
Right. Deregulation, privatization.
Exactly. All that. And the core promise of this whole ideology was that it would kick off this new era of market efficiency, more growth, and that this growth would benefit everyone.
Yeah, the classic rising tide lifts all boats argument. Free up the market, the whole economic pie gets bigger, everyone gets a bigger slice, even if the slices aren't perfectly even.
That was the sales pitch. But the reality, when you look at the actual data, it's been a pretty spectacular failure, even just on its own terms.
How so?
Well, far from speeding up growth, the economy has fundamentally slowed down since this neoliberal turn. If you look back at the post-war era, say 1950 to 1980,
Okay.
the U.S. averaged an annual GDP growth rate of about 3.9%. And that was a time with stronger unions, much higher top tax rates, significant public investment.
Right, a different model.
A very different model. Now, since 1980, the average annual growth rate has dropped pretty significantly, down to only 2.6%.
So, hold on. We basically gave up things like stronger regulations and progressive taxes, supposedly to get faster growth, and we didn't even get the growth.
Pretty much. We didn't get the growth.
So what did we get instead?
What we got was an unprecedented, almost unbelievable concentration of wealth right at the very top. That's the real outcome of this shift. Look at the global increase in wealth between, say, 1995 and 2021.
Right.
The global top 1%. They captured a staggering 38% of all that new wealth generated worldwide.
38%.
Yeah.
For 1% of the people.
Now, compare that to the bottom 50% of the world's population. That's, 3.5 billion people?
Yeah.
They collectively captured, wait for it, just 2% of that global wealth increase.
2% for half the planet. That disparity, It's not just inequality, is it? It feels more like an active structure of extraction.
That's a good way to put it. 38% for the richest tiny fraction, 2% for the poorest half of humanity.
Yeah.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that scale.
It really speaks volumes about the priorities baked into the system itself.
It does. And this funneling of wealth upwards, it's directly linked to policy choices. You can see huge differences even when you compare highly developed, wealthy democracies.
Like comparing the U.S. and Europe.
Exactly. So in the United States, the ratio of income earned by the top 10% versus the bottom 50% is about 17 to 1.
17 times more.
Right. But if you look across the European Union, where you generally have different social safety nets, different tax structures, that ratio is much lower. It's around 9 to 1.
That's a massive difference. So you're saying the economic gap we feel here in the U.S. is almost twice as bad as in similar developed countries, and that difference comes down to policy, political choices.
Precisely. It's not some law of nature. It's a policy outcome. And, when the results of these policies slow growth, extreme wealth concentration become kind of hard to defend.
Yeah.
The system needs a story, a narrative to justify the failure. And that brings us to what some call the myth of individual failure, or maybe the skills story.
Ah, yes, the ultimate deflection tactic.
It really is. The skills story pushes this idea of human capital. It suggests that if the system isn't working for you, well, it must be because you are somehow inadequate.
It's your fault.
Right. Low wages, rising inequality. The solution offered is always for individuals to just upskill, get more education, adapt better to what the market wants. It completely shifts the blame away from the structural failures, deregulation, lack of redistribution, and puts the entire weight of success or failure onto the individual person.
That idea sounds appealing, I guess, on the surface, because obviously education and skills are important.
Of course.
But the research seems to show this narrative just completely falls apart when you look at the evidence.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The massive scale of inequality we see today just cannot be adequately explained by gaps in skills or education alone.
Okay.
And what's more, the education system itself, especially in places with really stark wealth divides, often ends up reproducing inequality rather than fixing it.
How does that work?
Well, things like school quality, resources, even educational tracking. They're often closely tied to your parents' socioeconomic status. So if you start poor, your access to the kind of quality education that might actually help you move up the ladder is severely limited.
And even for folks who manage to jump through all those hoops, get the student loans, earn the degree, the economic payoff isn't what it used to be?
It isn't. The wage premium you get for having a standard 4-year college degree, which used to be the great engine of mobility in the 20th century, it basically stalled out in the early 2000s.
Really?
Yeah. Nowadays, the major benefits of higher education tend to go almost exclusively to those with high-end or graduate degrees. Think specialized fields, STEM, finance, certain kinds of globalized knowledge work. The market seems saturated with general undergraduate degrees, making them far less of a guaranteed ticket to the middle class.
So the rungs on the ladder are getting further apart, and the bottom ones are kind of breaking off.
That's a good metaphor. And it feeds directly into this crisis of mobility, which might be the most, gut-wrenching outcome of this whole post-1980s structure.
Yeah, tell us about that.
It's really the clearest sign of the social contract breaking down.
Yeah.
We need to separate two types of mobility here.
Okay.
There's relative mobility. That's your ability to move up or down the economic ladder compared to, say, your neighbors. That's gotten worse since 1980. The social ladder is just stickier, more rigid.
Harder to climb.
Right. But the real tragedy is in absolute mobility.
Which is whether you end up doing better than your parents did.
Exactly. It's that foundational promise of generational progress. Like the American dream, right?
Yeah.
So for kids born in 1940, 90%, 90% went on to earn more than their parents did.
90%. Wow, that sounds like a functioning social contract.
It does. Now think about kids born in the 1980s. The generation that grew up right in the thick of these neoliberal policies.
Okay.
That number, it drops to only 50%.
Yeah. That statistic is just devastating. Half the current working population is looking back at their parents' generation and seeing more stability, more opportunity than they have now.
And the research suggests that just trying to boost GDP growth rates won't fix this. Even if we miraculously got back to that 3.9% annual growth.
It wouldn't be enough.
No. The issue is purely about distribution. Unless the wealth being created at the top gets redistributed through actual policy changes, the vast majority of people are likely to see their absolute mobility continue to decline.
Okay, so the economic system is basically designed to funnel wealth upwards. Then it tells the majority that it's their own fault for not having the right skills. And all the while, it's actively removing the rungs from the economic ladder beneath them.
That's a pretty accurate summary.
Which leads us perfectly into this intersection of market competition and structural racism.
Right, because neoliberal theory often had this side argument. The idea that competitive markets would naturally compete away discrimination.
How is that supposed to work?
The thinking was, if an employer refused to hire qualified workers of color, they'd be less efficient than their competitors who did. So eventually the market itself would sort of force equality.
Okay.
Which meant that any remaining racialized inequality could again be framed as just, a result of individual choices or maybe a lack of ambition. Blaming the victim again.
But the reality is, the markets, far from competing away discrimination, seem to have actually reinforced it. They seem highly efficient at maintaining these gaps. Why did that prediction fail so spectacularly?
Because the theory completely ignores the massive compounding structural advantage that historical inequality provides. The data just utterly debunks this idea that market efficiency automatically corrects racial gaps.
Give us an example.
Okay, consider this really powerful fact. Black households, headed by someone with a college degree, have less wealth, on average,
Less wealth.
than white households headed by someone without a high school degree.
Let that sink in. A college degree, the thing that's supposed to be the great equalizer. It doesn't give a black household the same financial security as not even having a high school diploma gives a white household.
It really highlights that the core problem often isn't just income, it's wealth. Wealth that's inherited, held in assets like homes, compounded over generations, often due to historical discrimination in things like housing and finance, like redlining.
Right.
And that stratification is just immense. White middle-income households own nearly 8 times as much wealth as black middle-income earners.
8 times.
And some projections suggest if current trends aren't corrected, we could be looking at over 2 centuries, like 228 years, for the average black family just to catch up to the wealth level white families have today.
That's staggering. And in the labor market itself, the inequality persists there too, contradicting that efficiency argument.
Completely. Unemployment rates for Black and Latinx Americans have historically stayed at about twice the rate for white Americans. Doesn't matter if the economy is booming or in recession, that gap persists.
So it's not just about economic cycles.
No. Researchers conclude this is driven by deep structural factors. Things like geographic segregation, unequal access to the justice system, historical inequalities that just keep compounding over generations. The conclusion is pretty inescapable. The system is designed, intentionally or not, to favor certain groups, regardless of individual merit or skill.
Which brings us right back full circle to my friend's casual comment over coffee.
Exactly. She was perhaps unknowingly just voicing the very assumption that the system itself validates every day.
Okay, so if the economic system is set up to reward failure at this macro level, what happens when that same system basically demands that individuals blame themselves for it? Where does all that economic and social stress actually go? How does it manifest, physically and psychologically?
Right. This is the crucial moment where that external structural political choice becomes internal psychological distress. It becomes trauma.
Okay.
And to really understand this shift, we first need to grapple with the concept of racialization.
How is racialization different from just, acknowledging race exists?
That's a key distinction. Racialization isn't just noticing difference, it's the process. It's how society takes a perceived biological or cultural difference, like skin color, hair texture, whatever, and actively gives it meaning, gives it power.
Yeah.
And crucially, gives it the ability to confer significant disadvantage.
So in a just world, skin color would be like eye color, just a trait.
Yeah,
irrelevant.
Exactly. But in a racialized society, it becomes this determining factor in almost every social and institutional interaction, which means people from marginalized groups have to be constantly vigilant.
And this framework becomes absolutely critical when we talk about high-stakes situations, like, say, healthcare settings, which brings us to this idea of cultural safety.
Yes, cultural safety is paramount there. Because it recognizes that a clinical encounter seeing a doctor, a therapist, it's never neutral ground.
Right.
It happens within a specific social and historical context. And that context might just reproduce relationships of power, anxieties that are shaped by these racialized experiences. Think about historical Eurocentrism in medicine. The lack of representation of Black or Latinx providers, the inherent power dynamics between a credentialed expert and a client.
So when a client from a racialized group walks into a clinic, they might automatically be wary of the authority figure, not because of how that specific person is acting, but because they see them as another representative of a system that has historically harmed or disadvantaged their community.
Precisely. They might carry a necessary built-in distrust that's based on collective history, not personal animosity.
Okay.
And this is why research often shows that clients from racialized groups frequently prefer therapeutic interactions that feel more casual, more collaborative, less rigidly authoritarian.
Why is that?
Because that collaboration itself acts as an immediate counterbalance. It pushes back against the traditional, often racialized power dynamic you find in many institutions.
And the toll of constantly managing these dynamics, of navigating microaggressions every day, institutional barriers, it goes way beyond just feeling anxious, right? We're actually talking about physical trauma here.
We absolutely are. Racism-related health impacts are severe because they don't just happen once, they accumulate. They build up as cumulative trauma, leading to measurable effects associated with PTSD.
Wow.
And these AX aren't just metaphors. They literally unfold in the body physiologically. They're driven by chronic stress responses.
You're talking about that wear and tear on the body, the allostatic stress load.
Exactly, the allostatic stress load. It refers to the long-term physiological cost of constantly adapting to chronic stress.
How does that work?
Well, when your body faces a threat, it floods your system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. That's normal for short bursts. But if this happens constantly because of daily microaggressions, fear for your safety, feeling excluded by institutions, those hormones start to damage your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your immune system. And this whole process actively accelerates aging. Researchers actually call it weathering.
So the systemic hierarchy we live in literally makes people age faster and increases their risk for dying earlier, for disability.
That is the tragic, documented reality. And the harms are incredibly potent across generations.
How does it get passed down?
Well, the trauma is often transmitted through things like vicarious trauma, or what some researchers term vicarious racism-related vigilance.
What does that mean?
Think about, for example, the constant debilitating fear and worry that Black mothers often hold for their children navigating a world they perceive as hostile. That vigilance itself, that constant state of worry, is a chronic stressor. It affects family dynamics. It affects the child's own emotional baseline, often long before they experience direct discrimination themselves.
So if the external system is constantly sending these signals of inferiority or threat, the ultimate psychological cost must be when that gets internalized oppression, when your own mind starts to adopt the oppressor's negative story about you.
It is perhaps the most potent, most insidious weapon against the self. Internalized oppression creates this fundamental split, this alienation from your authentic self, because the individual starts to actually believe the negative stereotypes or messages they've absorbed from the environment around them.
How does that psychological struggle actually show up, like in observable behavior?
Oh, it can take many forms. Often it's rooted in self-silencing.
Staying quiet.
Right. Individuals might choose not to speak out, avoid raising difficult conversations, maybe in professional settings, for fear of being labeled, aggressive or difficult or not a team player.
Yeah.
We see examples in studies, like an East Asian participant describing how they learned to be the hardworking person who doesn't make trouble, or being categorized internally or externally as a servant type who just avoids confrontation at all costs.
And there's often profound shame tied up in this history too, isn't there?
Absolutely. Think about the shame carried by, say, a grandfather who survived something like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the head tax, but then refused to ever speak about that experience. That silence, while understandable, is a form of internalized oppression. It's an attempt to make a traumatic past disappear.
What are other ways it shows up?
Other coping mechanisms might include actively trying to disappear into whiteness, trying to assimilate completely, or very commonly, especially in professional contexts, wearing a mask, performing a version of yourself that adapts perfectly to the dominant culture, often just for safety or for career survival.
That idea of wearing a mask, it resonates with the friend I mentioned at the beginning, her good person facade. It really highlights the immense psychological labor that's required just to navigate everyday society when you're constantly aware of the judgments being cast on you based on group identity.
And that leads us directly to the cognitive model of distress. This is the mechanism therapists often use to explain how these internalized destructive hierarchies translate into concrete physical symptoms. Things like the headaches you mentioned, body pain, insomnia, irritability.
Can you walk us through that cycle, the cognitive behavioral model?
Sure, it's basically a loop. You have cognition, your thoughts. These feed your feelings on, affect your feelings or emotions, which then drive your behaviors.
Okay.
So when individuals absorb these negative societal messages, they could turn into core beliefs. These are deeply held, often damaging views about yourself or the world. Things like, I deserve to be blamed, or I'm responsible for everything.
Right.
These core beliefs then trigger negative automatic thoughts, those quick, often unconscious judgments that pop into your head. And these thoughts constantly reinforce the negative feelings and problematic behaviors, creating this continuous loop of distress.
Let's try to make this really tangible. Can we apply it to a specific case, like Liz from the research? What was going on with her?
Right, Liz. She was a client who came in with significant physical symptoms, severe headaches, chronic body pains, trouble sleeping, and she rightly suspected these were physical signs of emotional stress.
Okay.
This stress was also spilling over into her marriage, causing conflict and making her feel profoundly irritable. She felt constantly overwhelmed by stress at her job and her family responsibilities, and her specific way of expressing this, the physical discomfort, the anger, the irritation, actually aligns with common ways psychological distress shows up among populations of African descent. These are sometimes called idioms of distress.
So how did the therapy approach, the culturally adapted model CACBT, address this beyond just telling her to manage her stress better?
That's the crucial part. The CACBT conceptualization didn't just look at her thoughts. It explicitly connected her internal cognitive patterns to the external structural environment she was living in. Her core belief was something like, I'm responsible for everything that's happening, which led to automatic negative thoughts like, if anything goes wrong, it's all my fault.
Yeah.
But the intervention recognized the huge role played by environmental stressors, specifically job stress and the potential for anti-Black racism at work.
So it named that possibility directly.
Yes, because Black women frequently report experiencing unfair treatment, microaggressions, things like that in the workplace. So this external environment directly influenced her perception of her own performance, the risks involved in speaking up or making a mistake, and that directly drove her anxiety and her physical symptoms.
So her physical pain, her emotional suffering, it wasn't just a personal weakness or a thinking error. It was a symptom rooted directly in the structural hierarchy she was navigating at work and probably in the community too.
Exactly.
So the therapeutic goal isn't just to fix her thoughts, but to acknowledge and help her navigate, maybe even fight, the external forces that contributed to those thoughts in the first place.
Precisely. It's the perfect illustration of how that macro-level programming leads directly to micro-level trauma, which means interventions have to happen at both levels.
Okay, so we've established this dual nature of hierarchy. It's enforced economically from the outside, and it gets internalized psychologically on the inside. Now we need to turn to the tools. How do we unlearn this programming? How do we resist? Let's start with the interventions aimed at dismantling that internalized program, those destructive thought patterns that keep people stuck.
Right. The therapeutic approach here is really focused on helping clients proactively unlearn those automatic, unhelpful thoughts that fuel negative emotions.
So not just managing them, but unlearning them.
Exactly. And this involves first identifying what we call cognitive distortions. Those are the unhelpful, often extreme patterns of thinking. Then it's about actively challenging them, shifting from just passively accepting these thoughts to actively reframing them.
How does that work in practice? Cognitive restructuring, right. How does that actually work when the negative thoughts are rooted in genuine, real-world oppression? It's not like the racism isn't real.
That's a critical point. It's an active, evidence-based process, but it has to acknowledge the reality. First, the client learns to identify the negative self-talk. Okay, there's that thought again.
Right.
Second, they learn to critically evaluate it. Ask questions like, what's the actual evidence for this thought? What's the evidence against it? Is there another way to look at this situation?
Okay.
And finally, they practice replacing that negative thought with a positive, credible, and present tense counterstatement. And this new thought, this counterstatement, it really needs to be grounded in something the client genuinely values. Maybe their faith, their connection to community, their personal resilience, their history of overcoming things.
So it's not just empty positive thinking.
No, absolutely not. It has to be credible to them. For instance, maybe replacing a core belief like, I fail at everything, with a more balanced and realistic statement like, okay, I am successful at many things, and if I face a setback in this area, I have the resources and support to keep going. It's really about proactively building a healthier, more resilient cognitive style, even in the face of external adversity.
And beyond just challenging specific thoughts, what other resources are really vital for recovery, for resistance?
Mindfulness and compassion practices are absolutely crucial pillars here.
How does mindfulness help?
Mindfulness is incredibly powerful because it draws your attention to the embodied impact of trauma, how it feels in your body. It helps the person step out of that spinning cycle of anxiety and self-blame by focusing on the present physical reality. Okay, here's the feeling in my chest. Here's the tension in my shoulders. This is what my body is experiencing right now.
And what does that do?
It helps you notice it without immediately getting swept away by it. It creates a little space. And in that space, you realize, I can choose how to respond to this feeling. It immediately supports a sense of agency, of autonomy. It transforms the individual from feeling like a passive victim of their feelings into an active participant in their own recovery.
And compassion. That must be the antidote to that self-coldness, the self-blame that comes with internalized depression.
Precisely. Internalized depression really forces people into isolation and harsh self-judgment. Compassion practices, and that means compassion directed both inwards toward yourself and outwards towards others, are vital for reversing that self-coldness, for fostering reconciliation with yourself and maybe reconnecting with your community.
Okay.
Research shows that clients who learn to integrate compassion are better equipped to navigate the daily grind of microaggressions and systemic racism. It helps reconnect them to a sense of their own inherent worth, their authenticity, the very things the hierarchy tries to strip away.
Now, there's a really interesting layer of complexity when we look at behavioral skills, specifically assertiveness training, particularly for racialized individuals. You'd think assertiveness is always good, right? And necessary for professional life.
You would think so, but it carries this unique risk. It creates a really difficult double bind.
How so?
Well, assertiveness is usually defined as, appropriately refusing requests or expressing your opinions clearly, but without hostility. Standard stuff.
Right.
However, for Black clients, for example, that very same self-assertion is frequently perceived by others as aggressive, hostile, or inappropriate, simply due to ingrained historical racialized assumptions and stereotypes.
So the same behavior gets interpreted completely differently based on who's doing it.
Exactly, which means they might actually need to develop two distinct sets of assertiveness skills. One standard set for everyday, low-stakes interactions, and a second, highly calibrated, maybe more strategic set, specifically tailored to try and counter those expected racialized responses in high-stakes environments, like work.
Wow, that sounds exhausting, like constant psychological calculation, always having to assess, if I express my opinion now, will it be heard fairly or will I face backlash?
It is incredibly exhausting. And tragically, holding in all that frustration, that anger, swallowing your words to avoid confrontation that directly contributes to the mental and physical health problems we were talking about earlier, the weathering effect.
So if assertiveness training is used in therapy,
the therapeutic approach has to be really careful not to just impose mainstream white cultural norms of communication. Instead, it requires things like role-playing specific scenarios where the client can practice addressing people who might misunderstand or misinterpret their assertiveness. It has to validate the inherent contextual risk that simply expressing yourself carries for them.
Okay, so that work on the micro level, the internal work, is absolutely essential, but it's not going to change the structure of the economy that's generating the trauma in the first place. We have to address the macro systems, too. What kind of systemic interventions actually challenge the foundation of hierarchy?
Right. Big policy change often gets seeded, or at least pushed onto the agenda, by social movements, SMs.
Like Black Lives Matter or climate movements.
Exactly. Movements like Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, indigenous rights movements. These are crucial actors. They actively challenge the political and institutional status quo. They force us to shift the lens away from just focusing on what the state is doing top down and instead analyze the agency, the power, and the new ideas coming from people contesting these established hierarchies.
So they're not just holding signs and protesting. They're actually acting as intellectual engines, providing alternative scripts to the dominant economic narrative that says inequality is inevitable or necessary.
Precisely. They work to break what we call institutional determinism. That's the assumption that the way things are now is the only way they can possibly be. And movements are often responsible for pioneering these, utopian or alternative models. This is particularly prominent in the global South, where resource inequalities are often even starker.
Can you give us an example of one of those grassroots alternatives?
Yeah, a really powerful example comes from Latin America, the Social and Solidarity Economy, or SSE agenda.
Sure.
This model was largely built by social movements, including indigenous movements, and it explicitly prioritizes meeting community needs, things like housing, food security, local education, over the single-minded goal of maximizing profits or financial gain for distant shareholders. It fundamentally shifts the core purpose of economic activity.
And there's also that indigenous concept, buen vivir, good living.
Yes, buen vivir. It's rooted in Andean indigenous traditions, and it's perhaps an even more philosophically radical alternative. It emphasizes things like harmony with nature, communal well-being, living simply, rather than the dominant Western paradigm of just constant economic growth chasing GDP numbers.
And that actually influenced policy.
It did. This philosophy actually influenced social policies and even the constitutions in countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, which is amazing. However, this is where the power of entrenched elites often pushes back.
The system fights back.
It does. So while buen vivir might have become part of the official rhetoric in some policies, when it came down to actually implementing things, many of the most transformative aspects got watered down, diluted by political and economic elites who wanted to limit any real challenge to their power.
How do they do that?
Well, for example, maybe constitutional rights granted to nature might be selectively enforced or ignored when they conflict with resource extraction, or structural limits on corporate power might get quietly removed. It ensures that ultimately market-driven policies still tend to supersede those truly transformative, communally focused values.
Which just reiterates that point you made earlier. Inequality is fundamentally a political choice.
It is probably the single most important lesson from all of this. That huge decline in inequality within countries that happened between roughly 1910 and 1980. That wasn't an accident. It didn't just happen. It was the direct result of massive political mobilization. The rise of labor unions, the civil rights movement, sustained pressure from ordinary people that led to the creation of the welfare state, steep progressive taxation, big investments in public health and infrastructure. It clearly demonstrates that collective political will is the only force capable of fundamentally breaking these entrenched hierarchical structures.
So if that's the case, then reversing the current trend of soaring inequality requires massive redistribution, doesn't it? To curb that extreme wealth concentration we talked about at the start, which otherwise just keeps snowballing upwards.
Absolutely. The money to finance equality, to make the necessary investments in people and communities. It has to come from wealth redistribution. There's really no way around it. And a key, probably unavoidable policy option is progressive wealth taxation, specifically targeting global multimillionaires and billionaires.
Because current tax systems aren't doing that job.
Not effectively. Current tax systems worldwide generally lack real progressivity, especially at the very top. And that's partly because the globalization of finance has made enormous tax evasion much easier.
And you mentioned some pretty astonishing data about how effective that evasion is, even in places we think of as having high compliance.
Yes, the data on tax evasion by the ultra-wealthy is profoundly disturbing. Even in Scandinavia, a region famous for social stability and high tax compliance research shows the top 0.01% of income earners manage to avoid paying somewhere between 25% and 30% of their personal income taxes.
A quarter to a third. Wow.
Yeah. This scale of avoidance, which is facilitated by complex financial engineering, offshore accounts, shell companies, it severely undermines the whole principle of tax progressivity.
So hypothetically, if the world could effectively capture even some of that evaded wealth and implement meaningful progressive wealth taxes, what would the implications be globally?
They would be absolutely revolutionary. If you allocated even just a fraction of the global tax revenue that should be paid by huge multinationals and billionaires towards developing regions, it could completely transform their capacity.
How so?
It would give them the resources to finance crucial long-term investment in their own human capital, education, healthcare, in essential equipment, in infrastructure. It fundamentally shifts the dynamic away from dependency, like relying on foreign aid, towards genuine investment and self-determination, financed simply by ensuring the wealthiest people and corporations on the planet pay their rightful share.
So this deep dive has really shown us that the quiet, uncomfortable judgment, that flash of assumption my friend made about social hierarchy, it wasn't just an isolated incident, some personal moral failure.
No, not at all. It's much more like a programmed response, a direct reflection of these deep-seated societal scripts that we absorb, often unconsciously. And that programming is relentlessly fed by economic systems like the post-1980s neoliberal model that systematically failed to deliver on promises of broad growth while massively enriching the very top.
And that structural failure gets reinforced by devastating internalized psychological trauma, leading to measurable health consequences, emotional pain.
Exactly. Which means the path towards a more equitable world has to involve simultaneous integrated action on both the macro front and the micro front.
You can't just do one without the other.
Precisely. We absolutely need those macro-level institutional changes, things like supporting social movements that challenge the status quo, demanding different priorities, and implementing massive redistributive policies like progressive wealth taxes.
But those big changes won't stick, or might not even happen.
Without the micro-level personal work. The work of unlearning our own internalized biases, reversing the effects of trauma through practices like cognitive restructuring, mindfulness, and crucially, compassion.
So it requires confronting both the economic structures that shape the world around us and the mental structures they've imprinted on us, allowing us to actually see and then challenge the programming that tells us who belongs where, who deserves what.
You know, the enduring lesson, I think, from studying these historical patterns is that extreme levels of hierarchy and inequality are incredibly persistent. They can survive for centuries, adapting and finding new justifications.
That sounds a bit grim.
It can feel that way. However, humanity has also repeatedly proven the capacity to choose differently. Through sheer political will, through collective effort, we have shown we can break the structures that confine us. That historical victory over entrenched inequality, the one between roughly 1910 and 1980, it serves as this constant, non-negotiable reminder. Systemic change isn't just a pipe dream, it's possible, it's achievable.